George, how are you going?
I'm very good, thank you. Yeah, how are you?
Very good, thanks, mate. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I've been very, very keen to have a chat to you about your podcast, and I have the last couple of episodes of this one. I spoke to another architecture firm that started a podcast, and prior to that, it was also the Design Emotive YouTube channel. So, a recent theme of something that's been really interesting to discuss has been, how can we kind of communicate architecture to the general public? And I think that's a topic that a lot of people find very interesting. So, I really want to dig into your podcast that you launched last year. So, do you want to maybe give like a little bit of backstory on the podcast during the pandemic and kind of where it came from for you?
Yeah, sure. Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me on. It's great to be invited. Yeah, so the podcast is called Another Architecture Podcast. And it did come out of the pandemic. I think the kind of seed of the idea was probably just after that sort of first 3 weeks of what the hell is going on, the world is falling apart kind of feeling that we all were probably having. Um, and Yeah, I mean, there's this whole sort of story to the sort of idea of how and why it was set up. But I think from a personal point of view, it definitely became this way of, I don't know, expanding in my kind of very shrunken world at the time, and thinking, oh, I can talk to people with a shared interest, other people that are doing what I'm doing, but anywhere in the world. It doesn't, and I can do it from my bedroom. And it was a very nice way, I suppose, a way of replicating travel in a sense, and then sharing that travel with people that might be interested in listening. But I mean, you have to remember, when I set it up, I didn't know whether there'd be anybody listening, to be honest. So
Yeah.
that's the
And,
context it was
I'll
set
see
up.
if I can like draw some numbers out of you at some point as far as like how many people are downloading. But it's so the format of the show basically is, I guess, what's a sort of simple way of describing it. From episode to episode, you're featuring an architect that you like, and you're obviously in these episodes, you're a massive fan of that architect by the sounds of things, just listening to you kind of talk about their work. So for the listeners, imagine George is kind of a kid in a candy shop getting to talk to his favorite architects about his favorite projects. So obviously that was pretty good for lockdown morale and everything last year, obviously. And each episode kind of typically centers on one house, right? One project.
Yeah.
Occasionally you might touch on, tell us a little bit more about how your firm operates or how you communicate with clients and things like that. But generally speaking, like the sort of the heart of the episode is like one really successful project. Like that's kind of like as a way of describing how you've structured the show. That's pretty much what you've kind of put together, right?
Yeah, it evolved into that. So when I first started, I think the first couple of episodes were more generic and just talking to a practice. And I think I kind of realized and got, I had friends that gave advice and things, and realized actually to have a vehicle to provide the structure for the episode. So there's
Mm.
this sense of repetition and knowing, I suppose, if you were going to become a listener and you were going to start listening. And actually, yeah, one house that I kind of just accidentally realized that nobody else was really doing something like that. So you kind of think, okay, great, that's a good thing. And it's really nice to focus on one thing, because with that focus, it's amazing what you find out about people, or what you find out about where they are, what the politics might be like in their region, or what the
Mm.
climate is like, or but it's all through, there's a structure to it. So I know that every episode I'm going to talk to them about that specific house, and we can almost do a walkthrough of it and take listeners through, because it's a really interesting format. A lot of architects that have come on, it's the first time they've ever done a podcast. And
Yeah.
afterwards, we always stay on and chat, and usually stay on and chat longer than the actual episode recording. I sometimes think, God, I should be recording this bit because this is
Yeah.
interesting. But but we stay on, and they're kind of converted by it. They're kind of like, I didn't really know how this would work, but actually it's a very different medium to talk about architecture than to look at pictures, which we're bombarded with all the time. That's what architecture is known for in terms of the main sort of marketing channel.
Yeah.
But talking about it is a very different angle, and hopefully
Yeah.
gives a different perspective.
And I'm so interested to sort of kind of pick apart some of the tactics that you've developed for actually breaking down a building vocally, conversationally, rather than visually. So it seems like my impression is that you tend to approach the building kind of room by room seems to be a common approach that you'll kind of go through with the architect. But I guess talk to me a little bit about, in terms of your game plan in your mind, now that you're getting really good at this and thinking about how the listener's not looking at the building, they're not studying it the way that we are. So we have to kind of make sense of it for them and talk through it. And I also have to kind of keep the architect on track that I'm talking to and these kinds of things. But what are some of the approaches that you've found work quite well when you're picking apart a house and kind of making sense of it in a podcast or a conversation?
Um, well, definitely trial and error. I wouldn't. I kind of
That
evolved
exactly.
and learned as I've gone along. But I mean, this is going to sound like some sort of shameless plug, but um, part of the sort of backstory was like I run a practice with Ewald Van Der Straeten, and we kind of co-run the practice together. We're best friends, and we go a long way back. And we have real fun with doing the work that we do, but we also have real fun with marketing our practice. We love it.
Yeah.
We love sort of sharing the stories, the process, to being quite transparent and letting people in. And it's a common theme actually with a lot of architects I get on the podcast of moving away from this sense of kind of hierarchy or something with architecture, like it's some sort of special higher arts, and it's not. We all live in buildings and we all know whether we like a building or whether we don't, and it's all valid. And we had about sort of 3 or 4 years ago, we had a sort of very random opportunity to do a TV program on a channel over in the UK, ITV. And it was a program that was very much kind of not the sort of field that architects would normally go in. It was prime time kind of evening show, and it was all about sort of stories and emotion. And it was this designing a house, the family moves out, they've usually got a strong backstory, and then they come in and they're exposed to this house all in one go, and there's tears. And it's hosted by this guy who's a kind of, it'd probably kill me for saying, but a veteran of sort of TV in the UK. And we were the kind of sidekick, we're the architects that are going to make this happen type people on it. And doing that show was an amazing experience of thinking about a totally different way of communicating architecture. And we were on set, we were doing what we'd normally do in terms of designs and advising and doing that bit that we feel that we're good at and why we were there. But when we were on camera, and you'd have directors there and you'd have various people all stood around, and they'd sort of script out things for the day of, okay, then we're going to do the reveal of the new walk-in wardrobe, and Alan's going to go, wow. And you'll get, and they give you this kind of setup, but they were constantly bringing us back to what's the geography? What's the narrative? Where are you? Why are you here? Why is this important? And it was a very sort of weird twisting for us of, you'd normally go into a room and go, no, the shadow gap here makes the room feel bigger, and we've chosen this color because it's this stuff. But it was, they kept saying, well, we need to know, you've just walked through a door, where have you come from? Nobody knows this house. They're only following the camera, they're not following a plan, they're not. And so you'd change your sort of dialogue, and you'd kind
Yeah.
of give a bit of where you were before and where you were now, and also timeline, because you were filming in various orders and stuff, and you had to constantly bring it back to timeline. So that, I think, has definitely been an influence on then I've constantly got like those directors in my head. And if I'm talking to an architect, like, where is this architect? What room are they talking about? So I'm often kind of bringing them back and going, that's interesting, because that's just after you come in the entrance and you've just experienced this.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. You do that a lot in the podcast. You're always just trying to add that extra context in there, that missing thing. And that was such good training for you, wasn't it? It like really, it seems like it directly led to this in a way that, where your approach to talking about houses is, it's sort of your background in that TV experience really gave you some of those skills that we're not taught right at architecture school, because we are looking at a plan, we are looking at something on a piece of paper or in a real building together, but you're talking about the viewer who's not there, they're somewhere else. So
yes,
that's really, really interesting. So you're thinking it's always about trying to connect, like, this room, how does this room connect to this room, where did we come from? And so is that kind of a really big part of the approach? And in fact, is that kind of the main thing that you're focusing on when you're talking about these projects? Or does your mind ever go elsewhere in terms of like, do you ever sort of stop the architect and think, do you ever try to dig a little bit deeper with them? I'm just kind of interested in your methods for exploring this stuff.
I I suppose the the ultimate ambition would be, how amazing would it be if you no, this sounds awful, but if you
Yeah.
had a guest on and they were crying, that you'd really got to some amazing kind of
Yeah.
backstory. That I'm probably like 10 years away from
Okay.
having the skills and
Exactly.
the audience for that.
Okay, so that's really, really interesting. Now, why do you think that would be good? Right, I'm interested because so you're thinking we have a guest and we have an architect on, and at some point they kind of like open up emotionally. Because one thing have noticed listening to many episodes of the podcast is that there are some architects that seem resistant to talking about their feelings, and they maybe talk about their design process in a very problem solution oriented sort of framework, which is fine and it's good. But as a listener, and particularly somebody who is in architecture but is not really in architecture, I'm not actively practicing architecture, I find myself kind of drifting off or losing attention, or I'm in the park going, oh, what's that squirrel doing over there? And I've just stopped listening to the podcast in a way because I think that they're sort of being maybe a little bit analytical, and I'm not really getting any sense of, well, what do they actually feel about this? What's exciting? What's sad? What's disappointing? There's that. So is that the kind of thing that you feel, really brings another? I love that idea that you want to get one of the architects to cry. Is that why is that? Why do you think? And why is that? Why is that something that you think happens later and not now? That's also something I'm kind of curious about. Like, do you think the architects are not at that point, or it's going to take the development for you of like a certain skill set in terms of really getting inside their heads? I'd love to know how you're going to do it.
Well, I think it's ambitious as in to think. I mean, so far everything has completely exceeded anything that I thought. It kind of just started out as this thing, and when it started out, it was like, how the hell am I going to convince somebody to give up their time and potentially give up part of their respect that they've garnered, and by going on a shoddy new podcast, and that could have been the perception. And so as soon as some yeses started coming in, it's like, oh, hang on a minute, this is great. And then obviously then I sent invites out that said, oh, I'm doing this podcast, I've had these people on as guests, and then it gives that certain level of gravitas. I suppose where it's going now is it hopefully might start getting to that point where there's, and it sort of has in its own small way, where people want to be on it, and it's not me begging and going, please come on my podcast. It's more, definitely. Please can we, and it would be lovely to be in that. And I suppose when then you've got that gravitas, I suppose I'm a huge fan of, I'm a super fan of Desert Island Discs. I don't know how big that might be in Australia, but
I've come across it. I think it's like pretty big in music, right? Like, see, so
well, so the format of Desert Island Disc is you have to be pretty damn successful or respected to get on it, and I think it's the oldest radio show in the UK or in the world or whatever it is, and that, going back to format, has a very clear format. You know what to expect. You know that the structure is somebody's going to be fictitiously cast away to a desert island. They've got, oh God, I hope I don't get this wrong as a super fan, this is bad, but they got 8 tracks, I think, that they could choose. And they've got to pick 8 tracks. And then at the end, they also get given the Bible, the complete works of William Shakespeare. They get to take one other book with them and one luxury item. Yeah. And that's a kind of a great vehicle and a structure for then you find out about the stories of things. But what's so amazing about it is the people that present on that are just absolutely incredible at just asking the right things, giving the right space to people. They might be talking about a bereaved father or something like that. And to have somebody that you're talking to about something as deep and raw as that, and to kind of go at it with the right sensitivity to be respectful, but also to want to find out more, like, oh, and it's just little questions like, oh, that must have been painful. Yeah. And then you can hear the silence, and you know that person is sat there, and it's just like they can't get the words out because somebody has asked them, are you okay? Yeah. Or that must have been hard, or they understand. And I know that's extreme. We're talking about architecture. We're not talking about and people's lives, but equally we are talking about people's lives in a sense. And I think the story is extremely important. And I do really want to hear that from people because it is about humanizing architecture. We're talking about homes as well. That's the focus of the podcast. It's not about hospitals or art galleries and big business. It's about designing for families. So the story about that family is as important as well as the story about the architect. And
Yeah.
and interesting, actually, yeah, when I started out, it wasn't necessary. I didn't have an idea that it was just going to be architects. I thought it was going to be clients and what's it like to work with an architect, I think. And then because lots of architects started saying yes, I was like, okay, great, I've got now a ready crop of content.
That's interesting. So, when you think about somebody really being emotionally invested in the project, we usually think, like in the media around architecture, we think about that always being the client. And we don't really think about the emotional investment of the architect as much. Even just recently listening to your episode with Nick talking about Grand Designs Australia, who I'm going to be in a month or so, I'm going to be interviewing again on this podcast. Just a little plug there. But talking about this idea in Grand Designs as well, that the architect is kind of this like secondary character that plays like a minor role, but it's really the hero of the project is the client, and maybe the builder as well. But you're sort of thinking more about, this centering it on the architect, and maybe talking about, asking them about their bereavement and hearing their voice crack. Like, where's that idea coming from for you? Why do you think that so from the sounds of it, you sort of talk about it as if I find that really moving in other formats and other structures. And is it just simply a matter of you're kind of curious about what happens when you bring that into architecture? Or is there something, what's kind of driving that, I guess? Because I think it's so interesting, like in terms of how do you go, so you go to that level where you find a way to talk about architecture in an interesting way, then talk about architects in an interesting way, and then actually frame them as interesting people, and podcasting as a medium to do that. So like what sort of that emotional angle, why do you think that might be like a missing component in the way that we might be communicating architecture?
I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, part of it is maybe then going back again to how the podcast formed and in what context it formed. It formed in a world that felt like it was falling apart, and in a world that felt like we were suddenly all isolated, and a lot of us still are, I suppose, as well. And in one sort of, this sounds sort of grand and heroic, and it wasn't. And part of it, this is just on reflection, but just one part of just connecting people again and finding it's those tiny little things. Architecture in its own little way can be that one little connecting thread between various communities all around the world. And ideally, I'd really like to be having people on the podcast from all corners of the globe. And it's only just sort of really, 20 episodes is not that many in the grand picture things, but it's that connection, that common thread, that commonality, that where we can sort of have empathy with others. And it's again, it's a vehicle. It happens that it's a good common thread that it's the architects and talking about the architecture. I'm definitely not, though, coming from the angle where I think that architects are underrated and they're not celebrated as the heroes. Because if anything, like I sometimes feel guilt of, we get a lot of exposure of projects that we do, and there's these sort of poor builders in the background, and structural engineers and mechanical engineers, and there's a whole team of people that go into projects, and the architects generally get a lot of the credit, but also what comes with it also gets a lot of the slack of if things go wrong. It's usually the architect that gets it in the neck as well. So there's a lot of emotional kind of drive linked, but designing and building a house is extremely emotional. So there has to be some interesting stories in there of we're talking about people's lives and moving and their dreams, and we're talking about architects' kind of careers and dreams. If they're like me, they'll have been dreaming about doing this career when they were in their teens or in their 20s, and now they've actually got the opportunity to do it. So there must be some interesting emotional kind of ties behind it. But I don't want to sort of be caught wrong, as in I'm not aiming to do my next podcast and aim to make them cry. As it's more that if that was a thing that's happening, it's like, wow, that the podcast must have really reached a certain level to be doing it.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Well, because you kind of talked a little bit earlier about you have a kind of an anti-elitist view of architecture, or you prefer it to, to grow in that direction, right? Where architects aren't this special category of people that are sort of above ordinary society, right? And that maybe the more transparent approach and through these conversations, do you think that maybe they start to become normal people?
Hopefully. I yeah, there's definitely a feeling of with a lot of guests, maybe the first sort of few questions, it takes a while for them to kind of warm into it, and they're obviously following my lead, and some kind of respond in very different ways to others. But it is great when you get that sense that they've sort of relaxed a bit. They might be sort of taking the mick out of themselves a bit, or
Yeah.
about the sort of whole process of architecture and things. Yeah, definitely.
On podcasting, because you know you guys at your company have done quite a lot of experimentation with different types of content, from TV, video, writing, all sorts of different formats, and it's one replacing the other. To some degree, you're kind of still doing all of them, but podcasting has kind of emerged as this thing that fulfills its own kind of special purpose, and it's doing its own thing. I guess, what do you see as the unique positives or benefits of podcasting for what you're trying to do here in terms of communicating these different architects and projects?
I think it's a very different medium to a lot of the other mediums we use within the practice, in the sense that you've got someone's concentrated time a lot more than you have them sort of flicking past an image on Instagram. And one thing I really like about podcasting is metrics don't really come into play too much. So
Mm.
Instagram, by its very nature, you can see numbers, you can see how many people's following who, how many people have liked stuff, and everybody can see it. And you naturally just get trapped in a loop of going, you want to get those numbers up, or you want to be competitive, and you want to. And podcasting is totally secretive. I've got no idea how many people listen to other podcasts, and that's actually I think that's quite a nice thing, because it means you're generally then not lended towards trying to up those numbers to show off or to do anything. You more focus, your focus goes more on just quality, and put out that quality, and as long as people like it, that's good. And that's quite liberating for the format. Hopefully, I mean, they're probably then going to change it, and then they'll become this other thing. But
Yeah.
and you'll start seeing all the numbers and stuff. But also, yeah, it's that concentration of I'll tell you, one experience I had was, we use a platform called Bowerbird for some of our press releasing things, and it's an Australian company. And I remember meeting like a representative in the UK and finding out about it, and then we were kind of curious to sort of set it up. I was going to be the person responsible for sort of operating it and setting up the practice. And they had this podcast, which was a series of like 20, 15-minute episodes. And it's the two guys, the two founders. And it just went through step by step of step one, why press is important. Step two, how to get your photographs, how to commission your photographs. Step three, what to put in you. And I just found myself getting quite addicted to it. And I was listening to everything. I was embedded. I signed up to the platform. We signed up to the platform. I thought these guys were amazing, what they were doing, and I believed in them. But they were also helping me, and that was long form content. Is that, I suppose that's the term for it, isn't it? It's long form content, and you feel like you know these people, because it's like your favorite radio show or something, and it felt very useful as well. So, you know, this podcast, it did start out as an idea of an issue. It's going to be something me and Ewald were going to do via the practice, and we were maybe going to do a platform where each episode was a helpful tip, or, you know, how to design the ultimate utility room, and how to do this and how to do that. And that was definitely in response to how good I thought that Bowerbird platform was. So I mean, the idea that there's people that have maybe listened to a lot of these episodes, and the idea that then what's that, maybe 20 hours of them listening to me talking, it's kind of funny, isn't it? As they must
definitely
feel like they know me quite well. So I suppose there's a knock on it. Definitely is a knock on effect of when an inquiry comes in and somebody wants to work with you. There's trust there. There's a relationship has already been built up without having met or communicated directly yet.
Yeah, and I think that's like absolutely spot on. But there's kind of and I'm sure that, you know, architects listening to this are probably thinking, well, you know, as far as it being something that promotes your practice or promotes you as a brand or a person or builds trust with you, you know, this idea that you would approach it by interviewing architects, your like competition in a way, not that, like, you know, seems like 3/4 of the people that you've interviewed are in Australia for some reason. So it's not like, you're kind of like, you've got your turf, George. Like, I doubt that your next door, the firm down the road, is going to be on the podcast anytime soon. But
Neil DeShaco lives down the road.
I know that was an exception. I thought Neil on the podcast, he is very close by. So well done there, very generous. But it is an interesting approach, because it's kind of going, common sense would say, hey, maybe the older generation would look at that and be like, well, what are you doing? You're promoting other people. You're talking about these other architects being great and talented and all these things. What are you doing? You're supposed to be talking about how great you are as an architect. So I guess talk to me a little bit about your thinking around that. Now, I understand that like you kind of did this podcast in some ways initially for your own kind of just joy and as a fun thing to do. But as far as you continuing to invest time in it and seeing the benefits of it, how do you sort of think about, what it kind of does for you as a brand, or how it helps you to build your audience?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, the thing with sort of neighboring architects and things, there are more actually coming up. Of when it first started out, as the invites were kind of away from London, because in one sense, there was a sort of safety net in, I follow a lot of architecture practices in Australia, but also I knew that I wouldn't be kind of hurt or feel like a failure if they all said no. So a lot of the early invites, I sent out about 10 and it was mostly Australian ones. And I sort of you just get on this roll of like, great, I can invite them, I can invite them, I can invite them. But most of them said yes. So then it was like, oh crap, I've got, that's, then it became very Australia centered. But, and an Australian guest, by the way, Nick Brunsden, coming on to yours. He's an excellent.
I know I've had a
podcast guest.
Yeah, Nick's great.
And an Australian guest generally, by the way, extremely. I don't know whether you get media training out in Australia in architecture school, but it's so good. But the I don't really care about. I suppose it comes from a point of demand and stuff as a practice, but now I definitely feel like we should be selected on merit. I don't care if somebody knows about another practice like Neil DeShaco, who lives down the road, who does amazing houses, is an incredible architect. If he won somebody over us because I put him on the podcast, I'm extremely happy, because I know that he's a very good architect, and we're all in this community together. And there's thousands of houses being done in London at any one time, and there's more than enough room for us and everybody else. But in terms of the going forwards, or what gain there is from a brand point of view, there's a personal gain of it. I got really excited and invigorated by doing this, because I think over a few years, I always regarded myself as a bit of an outsider in architecture. Of I love it, but I always felt like, am I a true architect? Because I don't seem to love it in the same way that other people do.
Yeah.
And other people seem to love the detail and seem to love various things. And I was like, maybe I'm more like, I'm very good at sort of, I'll do the work and then I switch off, and then I'm with my family and I have other hobbies and I have other things. And I don't sort of live in the world of architecture as such. But actually then by doing this podcast, I was like, oh, who am I kidding? That's not true. I'm really into this. It's just, I'm not into certain parts of architecture, I suppose. I'm not massively into like hanging out at events and talking with other architects, but I just love sharing design ideas and sharing things that might help people that are actually doing their homes and stuff. And I love finding out about other architects. But yeah, there's this, I suppose from a brand point of view, it's not going to do any harm for people to know that I'm curious. Because if you're hiring an architect, anybody that's going to be doing anything that's creative has to have curiosity. It's the number one skill, I think, probably over anything else. And so I suppose, the medium doesn't do any harm in that respect. I'm learning all the time. I come off every episode, I come off and I speak to somebody and I'm inspired of it feels very liberating. It feels like I've been shaken up of, you can do stuff a different way. It doesn't have to be this way. And the very first episode I did was with Wawawa Architects in Melbourne. And, the buzz I had coming off that of, I could just sense it when I was doing drawings in the months following after that of projects for other people's houses. I could sense that I had a little bit of a voice in the back of my head saying, you can do it this way. Who cares? Paint the room
Yeah.
paint the room bright yellow and have a cantilevered column sticking out of the bathroom, or and
Yeah.
do a wavy roof or whatever. It was like this liberating feeling. And I don't think I would have got that if I just was a fan of Wawawa and just looked at their Instagram. I
Mm.
got it because I spoke to them. I knew that they were about to have a baby. I knew that they were funny and
Yeah.
lovely, engaging people. I could sense that they were good bosses. They were good people to work for, and that their clients loved them. And all of that came through conversation. It didn't come through looking at images.
Yeah.
And so hopefully that's getting to the nub of it. It's then trying to share that enthusiasm and what I'm gaining from it with everybody else, I
Yeah.
suppose.
Yeah. Right. Okay. And so, in terms of those other ideas that you were considering about creating something that was initially you were thinking maybe going to be more educational, has this sort of
Mm.
changed your perspective maybe on, how it feels as a content creator to go down like an education route versus a maybe inspiration or even possibly like entertainment sort of route? Probably more inspiration than anything.
Mm-hmm.
Although not to say that the way that you're approaching interviews isn't also very educational, but do you,
Mm.
we're generally drawn as content makers towards how to do this, tips to do that. Um, do you feel like you've kind of gone to a different place with it, where you feel like there's just a different direction to go as a content creator? Do you kind of look on maybe the direct or straightforward educational stuff a little bit differently than you did before going on this journey with the podcast?
Um, yeah, definitely. I think I'm speaking to people that are extremely successful and extremely talented, and I can't. It'd be undeniable to say that I'm not taking away something from that, from speaking to all these people and being influenced. And yeah, and a lot of these people, it comes from there's a very good blog post of yours that where you talk about focusing on how you're selling your architecture, and don't focus on the process and the strategy for delivering the project. Focus on the sort of, I can't remember, you use the wording way better than me, but focus on the dream, focus on the what you're giving in terms of the design and the vision. And generally they should trust that they see pictures on the website, they see your client testimonials, they'll trust that therefore the process must be good. So and yeah, so as a practice, we're definitely having a bit more of a focus towards that way, because demand is massively increasing for us at the moment. We're incredibly lucky in that sense. And I think, put it in a very literal way, if if we were sort of younger and we were really needed the work, we were a newer practice, we'd probably be selling, look, we'll do this for you, we'll do this for you, we'll do that for you, we'll monitor these spreadsheets for you, we'll assist you, we'll even walk you through the door when you've got the home, and we'll carry your luggage for you. And you want to sort of do all this stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas then I suppose once you've got a bit more confidence and you've got a bit more demand and things, we do all that stuff anyway, and we know we do all that stuff, and we know we're good at that stuff. But maybe we don't need to shout about that stuff as much as just inspiring how a house is transformed, and that very initial part of design. Does that answer the question?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is interesting, because I think there's like this kind of there is this journey that you go through as a content creator, because you guys have already sort of paid your dues in the sort of educational like tips and stuff space. I mean, that's something that you've kind of gone through. But I think the strategy that you're approaching right now, it feels to me like it's in combination with the other things that you're doing, like Two Architects, which we'll talk about.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, because it's much more of a draw for people because of that inspirational aspect of things. But it's interesting. Like, I could imagine that if you were starting a studio today, it probably wouldn't hurt you to go around to a bunch of very prominent, well-known architects that have large audiences and large channels and interview them and get cross-promoted to their audiences and start to actually build a profile that way. So, I mean, it must be the case that, any new listeners or any new audience that you're gaining could be coming through, discovery through the Apple podcast store. They could be discovering you through Spotify. But I can imagine that a big part of it is also that the architects that you're interviewing are sharing the podcast, they're promoting the podcast, and that's actually helping to introduce people to your brand for the first time, right?
Yeah, I think that was one sort of discovery part very early on of setting up the podcast, is A, the realizing no one else is doing this,
Yeah.
and B, realizing that actually these people that I was in my own sort of way idolizing and thinking they're going to reject me, and they're not going to be interested because they're too busy,
Mm.
actually haven't been asked by anybody to go on a podcast.
No,
And
very few
suddenly it's
people.
like, this is gold dust.
Yeah.
I was like, I could talk to wow architects, and they'll come on my podcast, and then I can't remember whether with them, but I don't want to say they hadn't been invited before, but lots of them, I'll ask them before, have you done one podcast before? No, I haven't. And you're sat there thinking, God, you look at their Instagram and think of the thousands of people that are following them, that talk about them all over the globe, and it's in its own, in the small sort of field that we're in of residential architecture. I don't want to sort of overplay it, but some of these people are kind of like celebrities in their own sort of right of what they're doing. I don't celebrity sounds like a very actually derogatory and empty term to use, but you know what I mean. That people
I'll use an even more shallow term,
love...
influencers.
Oh God. But yeah, but people follow these architects and absolutely love and are inspired by what they're doing, but they're not being given a platform for actual content. And also, we do so much press, and when we put out a project, the amount of times that a project gets published and it's just the text that I've prepared and written saying the family moved here and and it's just copy and pasted onto that platform, onto these sort of websites all over the world. That's not telling anybody anything. All it's doing is repeating what I've said about the projects. And the gold dust projects are like, or press, let's say like the Sunday Times newspaper over here in the UK, where you get a journalist that comes on, interviews the family, interviews the architect, visits the house, and they tell a story. And the podcast is another way of doing that and giving people that kind of rich, in-depth inquiry into how they work, and hopefully advertising their practice and their work, which I'm more than happy to do, because they are all talented and bit by bit making the world better in terms of nicer homes and whatnot.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think you also develop, you're cherry picking architects that you like, that align with, you like their work. Like, it's in your style, to put it kind of simply, like in terms of, this is the sort of stuff I like. And you're looking to align yourself with clients who also kind of have similar tastes and like the same kinds of things. And they like the yellow room and the column or whatever. So by creating this podcast where you're kind of curating and collecting the voices of all these interesting architects that suit your kind of architectural agenda, so to speak, it actually creates a little bit of a like a honeypot for ideal clients to come along and listen to you, because you're going, we're doing everything we can over here to be as interesting as we can possibly be. And we're putting out loads of stuff and images and all that's there for you to enjoy. But guess what else we've got? We've also got a stacked lineup of fascinating, wonderful, amazing architects that you can also come and enjoy. It's just like the ultimate good client attractant, in my opinion. And, I even sort of, I sort of do this podcast for the same reason, that I talk to architects that I think are interesting, that I think have a really good positive attitude to business and marketing and the internet and all these kinds of things and technology. And because I want to be able to attract architects to my audience that have that same sort of outlook, and they find it interesting when an architect starts a podcast or does these kinds of things. So it's a way of you kind of bringing those people across. But I really love your comments about, the fact that you start turning up in the architecture media and you go, wait a minute, is anybody writing any of this stuff down? Like, is anyone recording? There's nothing here. It's very, it's like, today's not to disparage the architecture publications, but it's like a popular project today is like tomorrow's chip paper, the way that it kind of gets, gets fed through, from the magazines to the online to Instagram and everything. And, in the podcast space, I think that's probably, I guess you're being kind of ironic with another architecture podcast. You're like, quite frankly, you're probably in a company of about 6 different podcasts on the planet to do with residential architecture. There's just basically nothing out there. And so that's quite shocking, isn't it? I mean, that you can come along and basically go, I'm going to sort of plant my flag here, expecting to find a bunch of other people, and you go, wait a minute, nobody else is doing this. Like, Dazine don't even have a podcast, as far as I know. There's
they
just
do, so it actually
do
they
they
start.
Oh God,
they started
well,
one up
there you
in
go.
like January. They started one up in January, and I remember when I was setting this one up, I felt this urgency of, okay, everybody's going to be doing this because it's lockdown and everyone's stuck at home. So obviously the natural medium is you interview people over the internet.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, everyone's going to do one of these. I want to sort of get it out there. I think it's a good idea. I want to get it out there before somebody else has a residential interviewing, And at the time, the two reference points of doing what was similar to what I was doing was Dezeen and the Modern House, which are estate agents in the UK, and theirs is very much based on the Desert Island Discs format of they ask somebody to know. And the Dezeen one is just is awesome. Like there's an amazing episode on there with David Chipperfield, and it's like, okay, that's massive league. I'm never ever going to
the real like kind of big names, right?
Yeah, I mean, what a platform, and what kind of skills they can have for interviewing and all that sort of stuff, and who they can get on. But the really interesting thing that happened was they must have all been set up for before lockdown, because the interviews were done in person, and you buy, I learned all this on the sort of fly, but you have a certain kit for recording in person. It's very different to the kit you'd have for,
of course,
and they had these first 6 episodes. They were incredible with amazing people, and then suddenly I sort of noticed they haven't posted another episode for a while. And then just as I launched my one, there were
they were done,
no new episodes, and I don't think they've done any since. And I don't know whether that was because to them lockdown was, oh well, we can't do this anymore, so we'll just have to wait. Whereas to me, it's like, here we go, everyone's sort of stuck in their home. Let's see, And so maybe what I should have done is marketed, are you missing the Dezeen podcast? do you need
is the Dezeen podcast not Australian enough for you? Then come over to another architecture.
So then I realized, okay, maybe everyone else isn't doing this. Maybe I don't need to be in such a hurry.
Because there's actually I don't know, I feel like within, are there any other podcasts that are like within the the modern home? Is it modern home or modern house?
Modern house.
Modern house.
Modern house.
Is that like fairly similar in terms of it sits inside this kind of residential thing, because that's kind of their business, that's their niche? Aside from that, are there any other? Who else is your main competitor? Are you pretty much top dog at this point, 19 episodes in?
No, I don't think
Are you the Joe Rogan of architectural podcasting?
If you picked like a set of parameters and narrowed it down, of the only podcast,
if you niche down enough,
interview somebody, it's one house, and based in the UK. I might come in a chart somewhere, but I'm sure I don't. I'm quite a lazy podcaster in a sense of like, I don't do what I maybe should do and listen for loads of other podcasts.
Same.
I don't put a lot of effort into marketing, but I think I maybe should start doing that now. It gets a bit kind of, it sometimes goes a bit sort of lazy, but one thing I think I'm good at is I stick to a routine. I get the episodes out, and the number one thing is, it's to have a podcast, you have to have the interviews. Everything else, in my opinion, is sort of superficial to that. If there's the audio there, great. Everything else is a bonus of whether you sort of do the Instagram thing and do other stuff. But I think in reference to some of the other questions you've been asking as well, it's a really interesting thing about the podcast of why it's kind of been slightly different in terms of how it approaches things, etc., is because it has psychologically been definitely a project that's been a personal thing that's separate to what I'm doing with BVDS. And the reason why that's affected things is it's just it's been quite a liberating thing to actually do. When working with BVDS, there's a whole sort of team that me and Ewald are responsible to, and we're responsible for each other. And there's lots of things to consider. Of I wouldn't just rogue put out some marketing content on our Instagram that's my own sort of personal view without kind of feeling like, I've got to cross check this, because the people that work for us, it's their sort of ambition they would have chosen to work with us because of the types of things we do. If I suddenly started splurging loads of posts about I don't know, hospital designs, and they might be like, well, hang on a minute, that doesn't really kind of align with what we've signed up for. Whereas here I don't have to worry about any of that. So although there is that knock-on effect of branding and clients and audience and things, I actually also don't have to worry about that too much. It's pure pleasure. I'm purely choosing who I would really like on and what I'd like to talk about. And I think I've learned that actually that's incredibly important as well. And maybe if that's a tip to other people, but it's quite good to have these little separate things, because then the time I put into it is my own. I don't ever feel like it's work, because psychologically I'm not kind of logging it as work. I'm just doing it in my own time. And that's suddenly, that was maybe the switch where I was talking before about, do I love architecture, do I not, or whatever. This is the first time I'm doing something that feels like it's actually hobby time rather than work time, and I'm willingly doing it. So that's clearly a good sign.
Yeah. I think that is a really good tip for people to actually create that separation, separate it enough from your business. It's still related and it still serves the business in the long term. But it isn't, you've got it in a different part of your brain. It's in the fun part where you're just having fun and you're trying to just do something that you enjoy and that you're passionate about. And people always struggle to think about, well, I need to do some form of maybe some writing or something for my business. Maybe a marketing person is like, harassing them saying you have to write, saying you have to start a blog, you have to have a newsletter. And it's always this very forced thing, and it kind of feels like a chore. And you go to pick your kind of topics, and it's like, oh, well, what can I kind of get myself through and put out and create? And that's not very good marketing, right? It's not going to be very good content. No. It's not going to be very enjoyable for people. You're much better off thinking, okay, putting the business marketing stuff aside, what's something that I could do that I would enjoy or be passionate about that relates to this area of work that hopefully that you still find some joy in. But I think your comments about not feeling like maybe the complete insider in the industry and that you maybe did feel a bit different to it is actually still kind of quite interesting, because you kind of in this project sort of explored what am I passionate about and kind of reconnected with that by doing it, which is really fascinating. So very, very interesting. And you guys have done a little bit of this you've got BVDS, and now you've got this George Bradley, another architecture podcast brand. Then you guys have George and Ewald, which is kind of a separate project altogether. Then you've got the Two Architects, and the Two Architects is its own sort of, has separated off on its own little satellite. So you've got the core brand, like the mothership, and then you're doing these little side projects. And each of them, like I remember when I first started kind of working together, it was like, how many, I would have to open my tabs before each meeting, open up all your social medias, all your things. And what I'm opening up is they've got 3 websites. They've got like 6.5 Instagram accounts. They've got 3 YouTube channels, like one little office of, whatever, 5 to 10 people. But you've got this multiple thing going on in your online, because you've set up these different identities that kind of keep them all sort of, what's the word for that? I guess it's like a quarantine. They're kind of quarantined from each other, and that you don't have these issues. So I guess your practice is pretty unique in how you've done that. So maybe do you want to talk a little bit, I guess, firstly about what the Two Architects is, now that I've brought it up, but also I guess how you think about doing side projects and having them be separate from the practice, and that not everything has to be part of the main practice.
Yeah, of course. So the Two Architects is, again, a lockdown project, something that me and Ewald set up together. And again, an idea of something that we were kind of half doing and then realizing, okay, no one else is really doing this. But it's a platform we refer to it as, it's a pay per meet platform. And again, it comes back to our experience, I think, with doing that TV show. And the thing with the TV show was, before doing the TV show, we had maybe an audience at the time of, maybe there's 2,000 people following us on Instagram at the time, let's say. But our main audience is generally the client that's sat in front of us in a meeting. And there's only so many of those people you can talk to in any given month because of time limitations and the number of people. The TV show when it was airing, was going to 2.5-3 million people per episode each time it was going out. And you suddenly realize, okay, if you say a tip here, or if you talk about something here, that's going to a hell of a lot more people. And it's going to probably very different people to the people that are coming to us as a client. And we knew that because the producers would sort of tell us what the demographic of the show was kind of like, and what the kind of people that would be watching it. And it was definitely not the sort of cliche, let's say London-based clients that we would be attracting as a practice. And so obviously there's this thinking of, okay, well, we're doing stuff, we're learning things, we think it's good and beneficial stuff, but there's only a very narrow field of people that are benefiting from that. Whereas on this TV platform, hopefully a lot of people can benefit from it. I'm sure a large proportion of the 2.5 million people watching probably going, well, that's a load of rubbish. The idea of the Two Architects was in some sort of way kind of distributing it out a little bit to more people, but obviously not that many people, but of finding something where people can sort of tap into what we're doing, but in a lot less pressured situation of signing up to a studio. And we're only 5 people. We have a lot of demand. There's only a certain amount of projects that we can take on, and we're selective about those projects, and we want to make sure that we're the right fit for people and that they're the right fit for us, and that they're going to benefit from a very kind of thorough and detailed service that we do. But there are other people that might have a lot less money to spend and a lot smaller project, but they still want the design ideas. They still want, they still love what we do and what we can hopefully bring to the table. And we're like, well, how can we bring that to people in an affordable way? So let's say we're doing a project that's £300,000 in the studio. We're set up for that, and we can, you know, the way we work and the level of detail we could give, our fees are going to be sort of relative that works.
Yeah.
If they've got 50,000 to spend, I think it sounds extremely insulting. And we hear it a lot where we get people coming to us and go, we can't find anyone to work on this. Nobody will take it on. They tell us we haven't got enough money, or it's too little, or we're not interested. And to somebody that's probably spent 10 years saving up £50,000 to spend on a house, and it's a hell of a lot of money, in a sense, that's kind of, it's not the architect's fault because it's the way they're set up, but it's also,
it's a bit belittling.
It's kind of insulting. Yeah, it is. Yeah. And I suppose the Two Architects platform is sort of saying, it doesn't matter. Like it could be £10,000, it could be £200,000. All you're doing on this platform is you're coming along, you pay for an hour, you get me or Ewald, and because we know it's an hour, the pressure's on us, the adrenaline's there, we will sort that project out. And but we will also tell people if they come to us and it's like they're trying to do £1 million house and they're trying to do it on the cheap,
you're like, come on.
You know, we're like, what are you doing? This is not the platform for you. But we'll give you the advice that you want in the hour, but we'll be clear, we won't just take on anything just for the sake of the buck. But yeah, so we're doing these projects with people where it's, you know, we might have a chat with them, we draw on screen, we invest in these tablets, so it's very interactive, very transparent. And people are like, the feedback people are giving are like, you know, somebody was saying, oh, we love the transactional nature of it. It's very immediate because of the time frame. And so they upload things onto this scheduling platform. They give us, you know, what I was talking about before about the emotional stories that you want to get from people in terms of on the podcast. We're getting it through this platform. Like we ask, they get prompted questions like, could you upload some pictures? Tell us a bit about the family. We hear about like their hobbies. We hear about what they're sort of stressed about. We hear about what they're worried about. And people give a lot. But then when we're meeting them, we've already got that information, so we can get straight to the point. We then get to sort of sharing some estate agent, realtor, whatever plans on the screen and drawing over going, well, if you move the kitchen here and if you knocked this wall out and you did this, and then it becomes this very inspired by your service actually as well, Dave, of this sort of accountability type platform of somebody can then book in 3 weeks time and have another meeting with us.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we'll have followed up with an email and said, right, you need to get a measured survey. You need to have a chat with your builder about what we talked about and see what they say about this. Speak to your neighbor and get to the showroom and start thinking about this. So they're like, great, they've got some tasks. They're doing the heavy lifting. We're just making them accountable for it and steering them. And the heavy lifting is what we would normally do in the studio. So that's where they're saving that money. So for a fraction of costs, they're getting that kind of design impact. But what's interesting then about the Two Architects is having it as a separate website and a platform is in the same way that the podcast for me gives just another outlet where I don't have to worry about too much stuff because it's just me. For me and Ewald, we always struggled with this being on this precipice borderline of, we want to talk to the clients that we attract and that we want to be attracting the work we want to be doing for BVDS. But we were also trying to talk to this 2.5 million type viewers that are based all over the UK and of different kind of financial means and whatnot. And in some ways there's like conflicts and sort of almost don't align. As soon as we set up the Two Architects, it was like a sigh of relief of, we can talk about whatever on here and we can give someone a tip of, hey, why have you got your washing machine in the kitchen? Move it upstairs on the same floor as bedrooms. It'll save you kitchen space and your laundry is right next to the rooms where you want them. And that's like, people love tips like that. Yeah. But maybe they don't really need to hear that on the BVDS platform. So so on the Two Architects, you'll probably hear about washing machines, and on BVDS, you'll probably hear about how to add a swimming pool to your roof.
Move your Porsche upstairs in the Porsche lift, and you'll have more and you'll have more space downstairs for your Peloton bike. So that's like more of that kind of advice, right? That's great. So that's right. You can kind of you can have different, I guess, different messages, different personalities. They share similar values, right? Like you've got maybe, 50-60% of the message is the same, but there's just these little bits that just are a bit more relevant and catered to those groups of people who maybe want different things or need different things from you. So that's really, really interesting. So, I mean, if you tried to, if the Two Architects was another page on your website at BVDS, it would be quite hard to actually integrate that into your business overall, wouldn't it? Because you kind of have to always be deciding, are we going to talk about one or the other? Who are we really speaking to here?
Yeah, definitely.
Always kind of become a challenge. So as far as like what comes with that, and I guess talking about, the downside of doing, I guess some of the problems of having multiple brands that you're maintaining that each have a number of social media accounts and their own types of content that you have to make, and the podcast and Two Architects and all that sort of stuff in BVDS. I guess it begs the question. I think what everyone's always probably going to be thinking, listening to somebody like you, George, is like, well, how do they actually like find time to do this? And it seems like, how could you possibly maintain all of that stuff within the work week? It's not like you guys have an army of social media interns or anything. So I mean, how do you kind of, I know that you don't have like necessarily the answer to this, but I suppose, what are some of your strategies of maybe like dividing this stuff up, or how much time do you sort of budget for these kinds of marketing tasks?
Yeah, I mean, behind the scenes, it's very kind of methodical and organized in terms of how time's apportioned. It's and yeah, I think, I can see maybe when you sort of put it in that way and looking from the outside, there's a lot of stuff going on. And we've definitely had a history of, you mentioned before, like all these different platforms and YouTube stuff and things, of, I suppose, a trial and error phase of just give stuff a go, and it's fun. And particularly during the lockdown, we had loads of stuff just stopped overnight. So we actually had time. We had less time because we were suddenly having to homeschool and do all the various things and not leave the house. But even still, we still had more time that's just not on projects because there wasn't stuff to work on. But the reality is, now coming into this year, is it's just about jettisoning things and going, okay, now we're at that phase. Okay, this is what we're going to focus on. This is what we're going to not spend time on anymore. And we do, like, me and Ewald are very excitable, and we get distracted and we go off and do these sort of things. And but very much more like, I've got 2 kids. Ewald has now got 2 kids. He had a newborn about 3 months ago, and that focuses the mind massively. So we have a sort of structured timetable of, we don't work full time on BVDS now. We've given a lot more kind of leadership and accountability to the people in our team, because we've got this amazing and very experienced and talented team now, which is a different place to where we were 5 years ago. We were very much a practice of people would join us after graduating and they'd learn with us, which took a lot of takes effort, and they're learning all the time. They're learning from people that are learning as well. We were quite young and new to things, and whereas now we're only a team of 5. So it's me and Ewald, then 3 employees. 2 of those employees are associates. So we're a very sort of top heavy, and they're very experienced associates and very talented. And we've started sort of distributing things. So we have a very clear structure of I'm responsible for marketing, somebody else is responsible for operations, somebody else for sales, and somebody else for finance. And we all wear these kind of hats when we come together in sort of team meetings. But over the sort of 10 years that we've had the practice, we've worked towards being able to be set up so that we can not have to work a full-time week. And we've always been a very good practice at that. We don't have a culture of overtime. We're very against that. And I was lucky enough I used to work for an Australian practice in the UK, Denton Corker Marshall, and before we set up. And I was really lucky there, of they were also very well organized, and I didn't ever have to fall into that trap that it seems like it's the norm. You work in architecture, you have to work all hours God sends, and you're lucky enough to be working in this design firm and da da da. I think that's all utter. Am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go
Utter
for
bullshit. It's total bullshit, and it's if I was a client and I was coming to a practice that is going to work creatively on my project, and I knew that those people were not allowed to go away and experience other things at weekends and go skateboarding and go to art galleries and go out for meals because they're stuck behind a computer working on CAD, how on earth can they be the right creative people to design my home? Sorry, I'm not going to go off on a rant there, but
No,
I've been
go for
really
it.
lucky that I never had to. And we were like, we don't want our team to have to.
Yeah.
But me and you will benefit from that. We hopefully lead by example and we do the same. So we work up kind of, maybe a 3.5 day week on BVDS, and we're very well set up that we give a, very focused time to the clients there. Then the time that we do the two architects is apportioned separately. And then the podcast for me is just in my own time.
Yeah.
But one sort of personal aspect of it is it's my partner. My wife is incredibly supportive and amazing, and she knew when I was setting up the podcast that she understood it and she understood why I wanted to do it. And it's two children and a family, it's impossible to do, as well as having good kind of organized structure and support within our team. And we listen to each other and we try and identify if someone else is busy, and we'll kind of chip in and balance things out or lower expectations. But it's the same, I suppose, within our family. And like my wife's amazing with that. Of we'll always make sure that if I've got a bit of time, like I have now, I'm doing this, and she's sort of dropping kids off or whatever. But then the same reciprocated, and that takes organization, I think. But I'm not. I hate mobile phones. I hate social media addiction and all that sort of stuff. I'm really kind of so I'm not. Although we do pump out a lot of this stuff, we sort of do it in quite a controlled way, or we're trying to control it more. Like Ewald, for example, has done a lot of that kind of stuff, particularly with Instagram and Twitter and things like that. But equally, I think now he's probably, he's a little bit behind me on the trajectory of, he's now got 2 kids, and your world definitely changes with that, and you sort of realize. So we're kind of looking to sort of distribute and ease out, but it's all actually manageable because we're now deciding to not spend time on things that we don't think are worth spending the time on, and just focus on good quality stuff. And Dave, we work with you. We work with you as on a monthly basis, kind of consulting, and you kind of give us that accountability thing that we give to clients on the two architects. And you've said so many times, like, you're doing too much, you're stretching yourselves thin, and focus. And that's really helping as well.
No, but you guys are very organized, and I can tell that you're not. That even though it appears like a lot, it's methodical, and you're always approaching things in a very methodical way. But I think sometimes it is tough to kind of work out, what is worth doing and what isn't worth doing. And sometimes, particularly when it comes to social media and a few other things, we can end up getting into a place where we do it in such a routine and almost like automated way that it ends up not working. It's gotten to a point where it's not time consuming at all, but it's also not very good. So we have to strike that balance of going, like, we do need to put a little bit of time into it, a little bit of personality into it, but at the same time, we don't want it to become, like you're sort of saying, a social media addiction. And it's not going to be the only thing that's going to do it either. What you guys have always done really well is had a portfolio approach at all times. It's never just like one thing, and we're just hoping that one thing, like there are some firms that go, I just hope to God we win an architecture award this year, because outside of that, we've got absolutely nothing on our plate as far as marketing goes. Or we really hope we get published in this magazine, or we really hope we get a lot more Instagram followers this year, because besides that, we don't have a plan, right? But you guys always have this portfolio. We've got different things kind of working together, and it's a nice mix, and they all kind of complement each other. And I think part of that is also realizing that not every client is going to come the same way, or they're not all going to be on Instagram, or they're not all going to be podcast listeners. You're going to have to do a few more things to really reach people. And I think what drives your practice to do that is that you are aware that there is a big world out there with a lot of people, and you actually you need to make a bit of an effort to really reach people outside of architecture, right? You always kind of strike me as quite mindful of people that aren't the typical people that are necessarily following along with everything that every architect on Instagram is doing. They're living, normal lives. They're not obsessing over architects on social media necessarily. So, no, it's very, very interesting. But it's thinking about you only doing 3.5 days. I mean, that's pretty mind blowing. And that's 3.5 days on BVDS, including the time that you spend working on the business, not necessarily directly working on the projects. So are you down to like half a morning from 8:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. on the on the projects, and then the other 3/4 is like doing the bookkeeping and sending invoices and running the social media accounts? I mean, you guys are extremely.
Okay.
I would love to see your calendar.
Well, I've got a specific, we basically have targets of where our time gets spent, and that is massively helpful to have that. So for example, I know, like, heading the marketing, I have 3.5 hours a week on that. And I'm now more and more, I just take the approach of, I'll be doing something like a podcast interview, say, like this one.
Yeah.
And I go, if it takes an hour or whatever, there's another 2.5 hours to work on marketing. It focuses the mind, because then it's like, okay, there's this other task that's going to have to wait till next week, because we only have a certain amount of time. We can only give our time to things, all of us. And there's no point in expecting more than that, because you're just going to run yourself into the ground. So it's very, although it's, all this, it's creative, and the industry that we're doing and stuff, it comes from a very methodical, time measured approach, which I think works. And no, it's not just half a morning on projects. The number one thing is, we're always reminding ourselves, like, we're designers. We shouldn't be doing your mind gets focused. If you're spending all your time doing some sort of Instagram type thing, and you're doing something that you don't enjoy, like I hate Twitter, for example. If I was spending all my time on Twitter, which I don't, I'd be there sitting there going, why am I doing this if I'm not enjoying it?
It's not rewarding.
I do really enjoy sitting and drawing. And it's our practice. We can make this however we want it to be. If we enjoy working on projects and dealing with clients, that's where we focus our time. So therefore, we have to be even more organized, and I have to be strict about that 3.5 hours on marketing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. And working with like the full range of architects as creative people and business people, in what I do, I find that like a very common sort of trait that leads to success in, like, somebody will say, these are my goals, this is what I want to achieve, or this is what I want my marketing to, how I want it to improve. Or typically a client comes to me and says, I'm not really doing any marketing, I've just been letting it go completely, and now I'm going to start doing it properly for the first time. And for me, often the thing that makes me confident that they're going to be really, really successful and that the process is going to work is, are they like kind of tracking their time? How, like, do they respond to emails from potential clients within a day, or do they wait a week and a half to get back to people? Do they use like an app to kind of keep track of what tasks they're working on, or do they just kind of write them down in their Moleskine and forget about them? Do they have a calendar? And I know this sort of stuff sounds almost like kind of condescending to think about those like details, but honestly, I think most of the time that time management aspect of things as a business owner is almost like significantly more important than the quality of like the marketing advice. Because like we can get you somewhere on some pretty. I can have a bad day. I've not had my coffee. I've missed breakfast. I'm grumpy. My greyhound's been annoying me, and I'll give you my best suggestions of what you should be doing in your marketing. I can throw out a few fives on the wrong morning, right? But if as an architect you're like quite organized and you're quite methodical about how you're managing your time, and you know that, okay, these are my tasks, I'm going to get these done, I've got this many hours, it makes like the difference between two firms over the long term of, even 12, looking at firm that's kind of all over the place versus one that's kind of got its stuff together 12 months down the track is like, it's night and day. And so I think like part of what works with you guys and enables you to do these things and put some time and some love into them is that the base of it is that you're actually kind of planning ahead, right? Is that the best way to describe it? You're kind of, we're not just kind of letting each day go by. We're actually having a plan, like next week, it's going to be broken down in this way, and we're going to focus on these things. This is what we want to achieve by this point in time. Is that kind of the mentality that you kind of go into planning the future with?
Yeah, a little bit. Definitely not week by week though, because then that also becomes a lot of work for us, we've found.
Yeah.
So we think more on a sort of monthly and then a quarterly basis, like every
Yeah.
3 months.
Yeah.
But a lot of the approach is currently, this is the time we're going to give to this. And sometimes some things are kind of less about what the output is or the outcome or the goal is. The goal is just to give that time to it. And that's quite hope, because all the team is involved. So I hope I'm in terms of the marketing and stuff. So the time that I give is one part of it, then other people as well. But yeah, if then somebody's got a specific task within that and all they're being told is just give this time and give it a bit of love, and that's kind of hopefully a nice way of dealing with something, rather than I need you to have produced 50 images by Friday. It's a different, and
We need 10
everything with
tweets
marketing
before you can go home. Yeah.
Yeah, and like the BVDS platform is, we sort of sometimes view it as this ever sort of a lurching forwards juggernaut, and with just constant input, which is kind of nice and considered and stuff, it's only going to go in one direction. It's only going to be positive.
Yeah.
But it's not going to help people if it's like, we have to have this many posts out and we have to have achieved this many followers by then, and target based. But that, that's because that's the kind of people we are and the kind of people we have in our team as well. They're not going to respond well to that kind of approach, I don't think.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, you're not kind of like the taskmaster and just, delegating the tasks that you're not interested in so that you can go work on the podcast while they have to, like, queue up 1,000 Instagram posts. And I think that's just really interesting because it does, I think it's, I think there are a lot of architects that are interested in having, like, how do we, it just seems so difficult to get to that point where you could see yourself going from, all we're doing right now is just trying to keep up with the projects. We're just like snowed under with like how demanding these projects are on our time. And the thought of, carving out an hour or two to just sort of work on something that's kind of a bit of a creative or a passion project. Now, maybe the podcast is kind of more, like you said, is more in that personal time category, but even just working on something that is kind of a rich piece of marketing that isn't just marketing, right? It's something where it's about something that you're passionate about, something that you're interested in. It's going to really have an effect on people. That does take time. You can't rush that, right? The same way you can't really rush your design process. Yeah, so like at the beginning when you do you find that you need to sit down for an hour or so and just like have a think about it and like not rush yourself? And it's kind of like a little bit similar. But yeah, it is tough. But you guys sort of went through that process of, I guess at the very beginning, were you always kind of organized and methodical, or is that something that you just have had to learn to do as the sort of the responsibilities have built over time? You mentioned having kids as part of it, but
yeah. No, it's definitely evolved and learned over time. We're by no means any kind of experts at this, or we're just where we're at now because that's where we're at now. But yeah, when we first started, I mean, it was me and Ewald, and we'd swap between each other's living rooms as the office. And when you're just sort of two mates that have set up, we never measured our time, and we just did stuff, and it works kind of on a matey kind of basis, and like, oh, okay, you do that and I'll do this, and kind of feeling our way through. And also you're in a different place when you have got no projects to market as well. You're in a different place anyway. It's so much easier when you've got the stuff, so we've had some years where we're just producing so much work and constructing so many projects that we kind of spoiled for, lucky to be spoiled for choice there, and we're a very different place. But we gradually kind of, when we started becoming like 5, 6, I think we went up to sort of 8 people at one point.
Yeah.
Then time becomes much more important, because suddenly we're accountable to them. And we definitely had phases where, people in the team would be like, where are George and Ewald, and why are they sort of doing this, a thing that we thought was important for marketing, but to their perspective, they're like, they just want our support there on the project, or to be by their side when they're dealing with a client and things. And that takes time to sort of find feet. And we've spent too much time on marketing in the past, and we've spent too little as well. we feel like we've got to a right balance point, because the ultimate thing is always in an architecture practice, I'm sure with most architecture practices, is the client and the project always takes precedent, and it should, because that's what you're doing. But if it gets to the point where you're constantly putting off just even an hour a week on just doing some Instagram posts or something, that is counter effective, and it's not productive. It's not a great way of working. There's always space for at least an hour a week or something like that. And yeah, we struggled in the past of, we'd kind of give a role to people in terms of marketing that was somebody in the team, but naturally they would always, if the client ever got a deadline, they'd always shift back to that, and that thing would get put off. And then we'd like bring in someone external that would run marketing, and now we've sort of landed at the point where it kind of, we feel it works better that we sort of run it and distribute tasks and keep an eye on people's time to make sure that there's half kind of, you don't want to leave people out of marketing because it's also fun. It's a nice kind of break from doing the project work as well. And it's a nice sort of, it's a learning experience. You reflect on, well, why are we doing this? What's meaningful about what we've designed? What's the message? That benefits the work that we then do for the clients. It's a kind of evolving circle. So yeah, it's a lot of trial and error and finding balances. But we used to have this thing for years where we'd be, anybody ask us about our marketing, and it was a sort of source of pride. Like, yeah, we don't spend anything on marketing. It's all word of mouth.
What, you said that? I can't even picture that.
Yeah, we
like
used
bragging
to
about not doing any marketing.
Well, not doing, just we don't spend on marketing. You know, people back in the old. I mean, we're not that old for the practice, but you know, the yellow pages in the UK was still a thing when we were first starting, and it's like you'd have to pay for adverts in that, and people would contact us and we'd be like, well, actually, we don't spend any money on marketing, so unless it was like a free thing, we would do it. Whereas now we understand you've got to apportion certain. You know, you have to.
I love that.
It's not measurable either, is it? It's like, it's long term. You can't measure this stuff and go, is it actually working or not? You just got to do it.
It's very tough. Just quickly on that, and we'll wrap up after that. But have you gotten any? It's not measurable like what you've been doing with the podcast and the other pieces of content that you guys have been doing. I mean, it's not like Instagram photos where it's like, oh, how many impressions did we get this month? It's not that kind of thing, but. Have you gotten any kind of qualitative feedback, or has anybody mentioned anything to you on the client side? Like, has it gotten to the point where maybe your clients been listening to the podcast, or has anybody mentioned anything about the podcast to you from that perspective?
I think more so with the two architects when we're meeting people.
Yeah, right. Okay.
They're definitely like, oh yeah, we listened to this podcast. But actually, I found it a more useful tool of, I'll be talking to a client, like often on the two architects, but also like BVDS, if we send a quote out or something, we'll often say, oh, you know, if you wanted to find out more, we've got this podcast, you might find this of interest.
Right.
And sometimes you can sort of give a specific, oh, you'll love this project.
You'll love episode, because we want you to do this type of house. So listen to that
exactly.
episode.
Or it kind of tunes. Yeah. But with the two architects, I've definitely found, like, I'll be having a session with somebody and they'll bring up something going, oh, we love this project. And then I'm sort of sat there like, well, actually, I interviewed that architect, and they're like, oh, great. So it's a really nice, the podcast is a really nice follow-up.
Yeah.
Thing. We don't really shout about it that much on BVDS, I suppose, maybe because I sort of feel a little bit coy about it because it's me. And but actually it's quite nice that kind of, it's very subtle, soft touch kind of follow-up thing of, check this out. You might like it.
It's a good way. It actually kind of connects back to what you were saying about the Bowerbird podcast. And I think that this is something that is quite true when you use podcasting as a business that isn't like heavy-handed in the approach. It's not like laying on the sale. It's just kind of, this is a good piece of content that you can, you'll be out, doing your grocery shopping and you'll be listening to me having a chat with somebody, and it's very personality based and it's friendly and you feel like you get to know me and all that kind of thing. That it's probably really works its magic in that kind of consideration phase when they actually either have already contacted you, but they're in that sort of that early trust building part of the process, or maybe prior to that where they're really very, very much about to embark on a real project, but they're just kind of warming up to you at that stage. And the fact that you might suggest that they listen to it actually might be one of the best ways, one of the most effective ways that you promote it, is to just literally go, hey, listen to our podcast to a small handful of potential clients. It could even be that might not even build numbers of clients, because that's not what we're trying to do here, but it's more about how much can you influence maybe the way that they think by exposing them to different kinds of ideas. Does it's something that you can use to try and actually improve, kind of, we're always looking to go, how do we improve the quality of the clients that we get or that we work with? And that maybe it becomes actually a really effective tool at doing that by just going. It's another way of educating potential clients, or exposing them to things that they might not have come across before, like different approaches that other architects have had and things like that. So, I mean, in the same way that Bowerbird's podcast was very effective on you, I can just picture it now, this podcast being such an effective way for you to go, hey, before we meet again, listen to a few of these episodes, this one, and this one. And then they come back and then they're kind of perfectly molded into exactly what you guys want them to be for the practice.
You think I should start sneaking in some sort of subliminal messages?
If they play it in reverse.
Yeah, like the Beatles kind
BVDS.
of.
Yeah,
Paul is dead.
Exactly.
Play it backwards.
That'd be great. All right. And one final note is, I think you guys need a second podcast, because you always like to have one of everything. I think you need another podcast for the two architects where it is the two of you. And that's going to be the next project to work on.
I really want that. I just need to convince Ewald.
Convince Ewald. All right. Well, we'll work on
he's
that.
Got a newborn baby.
Well, got to make some. You got to keep your eye on the ball. The podcasting game is fresh. We've got to get involved, and then we'll be on Clubhouse, and then we'll be on TikTok. That's what we're going to be doing for the firm in the near future, I think. George,
no
thank
more
you.
Platforms, please.
No. There's always going to be more platforms. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast and talking about your podcast. And I'm going to do the outro, and I'm going to tell everybody like exactly what they need to do to go listen to it. But it was a real pleasure having you on to talk about it, and I'm looking forward to listening to more episodes as well.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Thanks. A real honor to be on as well. Thank you.